Bonsoir tout le monde. Nous allons commencer. Bonsoir et bienvenue à la réunion du comité mixte spécial sur l'aide médicale à mourir. Je souhaite la bienvenue aux membres du comité, aux témoins et aux gens du public qui suivent cette réunion sur le web. My name is Mark Garneau and I am the House of Commons Joint Chair of this committee, and I'm joined by the Honourable Jana Martin, the Senate's Joint Chair. Today we are continuing our examination of the statutory review of the provisions of the Criminal Code related to medical assistance in dying and their application. A few administrative points. I'd like to remind members and witnesses to keep their microphones muted unless recognized by name by one of the joint chairs. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the joint chairs. Lorsque vous parlez, s'il vous plaît, exprimez-vous lentement et clairement pour les interprètes. Les services d'interprétation à faire pour cette vidéoconférence sont les mêmes que ceux à faire pour une réunion en personne. Au bas de votre écran, vous pouvez choisir entre le parquet, l'anglais ou le français. With that, I would like to welcome our witnesses for Panel 1 who are here to discuss mature minors. As individuals, we have present with us Dr. Don Davies, pediatrician, palliative care physician. And with us remotely, we have Cheryl Milne, Executive Director of the David Asper Center for Constitutional Rights. As well, from the Hospital for Sick Children, we have Randy Zlotnick-Shaul, I hope I pronounced that properly, Director of the Department of Bioethics. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us tonight. And we'll begin with opening remarks followed by questions for the panelists. These are 5-minute opening remarks, and I'd like to start with Dr. Davies. Dr. Davies, if you're ready, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. I think mine will be somewhat less than that. So I'm hoping what I can share with you tonight is maybe just some of the practical experiences I've had in the last 25 years or so working with children, families, and youth as a palliative care physician for children. And also, I was the chair of the CPS, the Canadian Pediatric Society Bioethics Committee, when the Carter decision was made, and I was the author of the CPS position statement on medical assistance in dying with respect to mature minors. And I'm hoping, I look at all of my learned colleagues that have presented to you before and after me, but I am hoping that somehow you've been able to hear the voices of children and families that are affected or have been affected by these issues, because I can think of so many families that I think would lend a critical lens to this discussion, and I hope you've been able to find them. So I'll just curtail my remarks to that for the time being.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davies. And with that, we'll now turn to Cheryl Milne, Executive Director of the David Asper Center. You have 5 minutes, Ms. Milne.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this hearing. In addition to being the director at the David Asper Center, I am a practicing lawyer, and I have spent many years representing young people at the Legal Clinic Justice for Children and Youth, including as an intervener in the seminal case from the Supreme Court of Canada, AC and Manitoba. So my background includes some knowledge in terms of how the law works with respect to medical decision-making for children. In addition to what the Supreme Court of Canada said, which was really that a mature young person should be able to decide, make these kinds of decisions, even if the decision has grave consequences, if they have the capacity to do so. And so for legislation, for example, there is legislation across the country that varies in terms of how the young person can make these kinds of decisions. So in legislation that articulates a best interest standard, for example, which occurs in some provinces, that standard should be interpreted so that the choice of an independent, decisionally capable minor must be respected. In addition to the Supreme Court of Canada, that's decision was based upon the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 7. It also based the decision on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the articles that are relevant are primarily Article 12, which requires Canada to give due weight to a child's views in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. Article 5, which requires Canada to respect the responsibilities, rights, and duties of parents to provide appropriate direction and guidance in the exercise of the child's rights in a manner that is consistent with the evolving capacities of the child. But there are also other articles that add complexity and nuance to those decisions. So Article 2, dealing with non-discrimination, Article 6, around the survival and development of the child, and Article 24 about access to health care and health services, all of which are relevant when looking at the provision of MAID for young people under the age of 18. In respect of safeguards, Article 23 also requires the recognition that children with disabilities enjoy a full and decent life in conditions which ensure dignity, promote self-reliance, and facilitate the child's active participation in the community. But one of my primary recommendations, and I think you've heard it before from other witnesses who have come before me, is the need to really address or listen to the voices of children and youth in these circumstances. And so I know other organizations have recommended something that's called a CRIA, or a Child Rights Impact Assessment, that involves both consultation with experts, which we are doing this evening, and you have done up to this time, but also consultation with young people who are directly affected. And I won't go on. My speaking notes talk about different vulnerable groups that are specifically you need to address. But I also want to say that in addition to talking to children and youth as a group and consulting with them, we have to remember that we can't really drag this out too long, because in the meantime, there are individual young people under the age of 18 who are potentially suffering and who are being denied this particular treatment. And so that their individual views and preferences are right now not necessarily being considered. And so while I think consultation with children and youth more generally is essential, we also need to think about the individual young people. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully I can answer more detailed questions for you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Milne. We'll now go to our third witness, Randy Slotnick-Shaw. Ms. Shaw, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you as well for the invitation to present to the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying. In addition to being director of the Bioethics Department at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, I've worked as a pediatric bioethicist for more than 22 years. I am also an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Toronto. With today's special panelists, I also had the honor of being a member of the Council of Canadian Academy's MAID Expert Panel Mature Minor Working Group, and have collaborated with dedicated child and family-centered colleagues at Sick Kids and beyond, grappling with questions associated with MAID and mature minors. A bioethics lens can be helpful when a decision has to be made and values at the heart of the decision may be pulling a decision maker towards different choices. For such challenging issues in healthcare, the aim is to carefully and accountably consider all relevant information, relevant law, clinical evidence, ethics literature, to make a decision that best reflects the values one considers most important and to minimize resulting harms. Through legal decisions from our country's highest courts and the checks and balances associated with enacting law, MAID is legal in Canada for those suffering from a grievous and irremediable medical condition in an advanced state of irreversible decline, experiencing enduring suffering where natural death is reasonably foreseeable, voluntarily requested by a capable person 18 or over, informed by the means available to relieve suffering. From an ethics point of view, Canada's framework for MAID is supported by considerations of beneficence and non-maleficence, the duty to provide benefit and avoid harm, and respect for autonomy and justice. At this point, the question seems to be, is there anything about MAID that should require a different approach from that which already enables mature minors to make other healthcare decisions for themselves, even those that may not extend life? Here, examples may include a mature minor opting for palliative care or declining yet another round of chemotherapy where it holds out very little chance of success. In thinking through these answers, one can want to respect autonomy of mature minors while also wanting to be confident that appropriate safeguards are in place. The current framework for accessing MAID has safeguards built into it that would apply to mature minors if access were expanded. For example, to be found capable of consenting to MAID, a person must be able to understand what MAID entails and appreciate the implications to themselves of consenting or refusing the procedure. The implications of capacity being decision-specific is that the more complex a decision and the more serious the consequences, the higher the level of cognitive development and maturity needed to be found capable of making the decision. These requirements are built-in safeguards, ensuring that only those who meet all the stringent requirements necessary for MAID and have this sufficiently high cognitive ability and maturity would qualify for access. I would add 2 additional recommendations. The first would be increased access to palliative care so that it is available to all in need as a possible alternative to MAID. That being said, my understanding from outstanding and experienced palliative care colleagues is that in rare cases, even what palliative care has to offer may not be enough to address irremediable suffering in a way that is acceptable to the patient. And finally, while the report of the CCA was excellent, working group members acknowledged that there was insufficient analysis of the views of young people related to MAID to feel confident that the perspectives of those most impacted by expansion of access have been considered. Missing are perspectives of youth with a range of relevant life experiences: Indigenous youth, youth living with disabilities, youth in the child welfare system, youth living with terminal illnesses, and their families. In keeping with the previous testimonies from Franco Carnevale and Mary Ellen McDonald, respecting our responsibilities to young people would include studying their perspectives and bringing their voices into deliberations about expanded access. Thank you for the opportunity to share these considerations. I would be happy to do my best to answer any additional questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Schall. We'll now go to questions, and I'll turn it over to my co-chair, Senator Martin.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our witnesses for your testimony this evening. So we'll begin the first round of questions with Dr. Ellis for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I have been a family doctor for 26 years, just as a full disclosure. I'd like to start with Ms. Schall, through you, Chair, if I could. You talked about having the opinions of kids from a variety of background, and certainly in the experience of this committee, I don't think that we've had the fullness of that discussion. And how do you see that playing out in terms of delaying the decision-making with respect to mature minors, with the caveat, of course, that we haven't had children appear at this committee?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. So I do think that's a concern, as was just mentioned by Professor Milne. A delay is not a neutral position. A delay is something that is significant, and it may be that otherwise eligible young people would not have access. So I think it is a balance that needs to be made here. The challenge, though, is going forward without these voices is really going forward with an incomplete window into potentially all issues that need to be considered. So, with humility, we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know what issues maybe or considerations might be raised. I'll leave it to this, esteemed committee to decide how to balance that, and if perhaps what might, be an option might be a staged expansion of access where perhaps, you expand. And again, this is your decision in terms of weighing everything. A potential could be, expanding to 16 and 17-year-olds now with a stated timeline of when this would be reviewed. So it's not an indefinite re-review once, the more fulsome window into missing voices have been included. So I do agree. It's not a neutral position just to indefinitely delay. but it is a concern to be moving forward with insufficient information. Thank you.
Very much for that. I appreciate it. And through you, Chair, again, once more, Dr. Davies, one of the things we didn't hear much about in anybody's opening statement today is really related to how do the decision-making of the parents play into the role of mature minors. And you've been a pediatrician for a long time in palliative care. Tell us a bit about your idea of an approach around mature minors with respect to decision-making and involving the parents.
Yeah, I think that's tricky. I think that I'd say in my experience, families are often, the child or youth and their parents are very often of the same mind. I've had a few encounters where parents and their child might be of different opinions about what they want for treatment, but as the child's illness progresses, I can't think of a situation personally where the child wanted one thing and the parents wanted something different. I think that with MAID in general, there are situations, sadly, where the person that opts for MAID does not have the support or approval of their family. And that may actually play out in the world of children and youth, but I think for the most part, there will be concordance. And for the rare cases where there isn't, I think that going with the decision of the mature minor, with all the caveats that Dr. Zlotnick-Shull just laid out, would be acceptable.
Thank you, Dr. Davies, and through you, Chair, once more to you, Dr. Davies. Certainly this committee's heard a fair bit about palliative care availability, which is a significant issue in multiple places in Canada. And maybe you could talk about your experience with that. In my mind, it's a real issue for children and adults, of course. And I guess some of the concern I have is related to the fact that people may choose MAID simply because they don't have good palliative care services available. Maybe you could comment on that.
I think that's true. I think if we look at adults that have opted for MAID, though, many of them have had excellent palliative care, and I think I'm one of the minority of physicians that I don't think palliative care is the answer to the question about MAID or not. And I think that obviously I'm passionate about providing excellent palliative care, but I still can think of families whose child was dying that raised the question, why must they live in this state any longer? And that might be an existential sort of concern, a physical symptom sort of concern. And I think poignantly of one family that I cared for recently where the child's mother had opted for MAID for cancer the week before the grandchild died. And the mother caring for this child that was also dying of a malignancy said, why can't we make this choice? And so I think that the mature minors are one scenario, and I think the parents of never capable children is another one, which I know is not the purview of this committee, but it's actually the question that's raised to me more often than from the youth themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, we'll have Mr. Maloney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all three of our witnesses, as is always the case. Your testimony is very helpful. Dr. Davies, I'm going to start with you on the palliative care issue. This issue has come up time and time again, mostly not in the situation we're discussing now with mature minors, but everybody around this table and everybody everywhere agrees that we're in need of more and better palliative care. But the fact that ideal level of palliative care doesn't exist, should that be a full stop to medical assistance dying?
I don't think so.
Okay. And would your answer be any different in the context of mature minors?
No, because I think for families that want it, it is available. It might mean relocating as a family for a period of time, but I think it is available in small communities. It's just how you build teams around that family. Might not be perfect, but...
Okay. You said something in response to Dr. Ellis about... we're talking about mature minors, and we're talking about a situation that doesn't exist now. This is not available for mature minors right now. So you made a statement to the effect that you've rarely, maybe never seen a case where when you get to a certain point, parents and child disagrees on what the appropriate treatment is. Do you think that's a fair comparison to make in the context we're talking about right now? I mean, it's an entirely different decision, in my opinion. I mean, palliative care or other personal health decisions are I'm struggling to find words, but not as significant as what the issue we're talking about here. So do you think that's a fair comparison?
I do think it's a fair comparison. You know, I think when we look at lots of decisions mature minors might take, it might be earlier in the trajectory, but the outcome may be the same. So if they decide against further chemotherapy or further immunotherapy, something like that, the outcome might be just as dire. It's just the moment in time the decision is taken. And I do think they're comparable, and I do think mature minors, especially those that have lived with severe illness, are very well informed by their lived experience to make such a decision.
Okay, thank you. So let's take the scenario a step further. Let's talk about a situation where they don't agree, and we're talking about MAID. What would you recommend that a doctor do in that situation where the individual under 18 is deemed to be mature enough to make this decision, but the parents don't disagree? What happens there?
I really think that if the youth is found to be mature and capable, there may be parents that can't accept the reality of that person's situation. I think it will be very infrequent, and I don't think that should be a barrier to what this committee recommends. But I think that just like in the adult world, we go with the decision of the person whom it's going to affect, which is the patient.
Maybe infrequent, but it could happen.
It could. Yeah.
And so my question is, what do you do in that scenario? So you're saying you go with the decision of the child?
If they were found to be capable, yes, I would.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Dr. Zlotnick, you raised some concerns in your opening and with Dr. Ellis about, you know, the fact that we haven't had children testify before this committee. I think you said it's an incomplete window. Are you saying to us that we should not proceed with the recommendation that it's acceptable to allow mature minors to access MAID?
It's a hard call. It is a hard call. I don't think that it should be an indefinite. Like I tried to say a moment ago, I don't think it should be an indefinite sort of halt until there's the most fulsome review of, you know, the positions that are missed. And I'm wondering if perhaps a staged approach to increasing access might be a possibility. You know, that I think there's a lot of confidence in 16 and 17-year-olds having this comparable or potentially having the same comparable maturity and capacity as those 18. Again, this is vulnerable, and I'll leave that to Cheryl Mill to speak to, but vulnerable to legal challenge because even accessing just to 16 and 17 would be considered an arbitrary cutoff. But perhaps as part of a staged expansion, you could do something like that where it's not left at the barrier at 18 right now.
Sorry, I'm running out of time. I apologize.
Sure. Sorry.
Should we do it now? Are we ready? That was the question.
I do think a greater access than what there is right now is ready, but it shouldn't be granted alone without a clear expansion of gaining perspectives that are missing.
Okay, thank you very much. And next, Monsieur Thériault, you have 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Madam Joint Chair. I'd like to address my questions to the three witnesses, but first I'd like to begin with Ms. Zlotnick. You were talking about extending access in stages, and you were talking about age categories. When we talk about decisional capacity, I imagine that this is something that can be present at age 14 or age 15?
So when the staged access is not a sort of an end result that I would, argue for. I absolutely agree with decisions being, based on capacity, and of course that is not linked necessarily to age. So I do think that is the ultimate place that we're working towards. But the challenge is at this, uncomfortable stage of not having had the perspective of young people informing these deliberations, how you move forward without those, that's a bit of a problem. So if middle ground, and I would defer to you how you balance that when you don't have complete information and yet there's such a compelling reason to be expanding access, if the comfort level is not to have the moving to the final stage of only based on capacity, that was just one idea. But really the end stage, I think... Yeah.
Excusez-moi de vous interrompre, vous êtes très intéressant.
I apologize for interrupting you. You're very interesting, but I have very limited time.
Try to be quicker.
Ça va.
That's fine. Now, once we've established decision-making capacity in Quebec at age 14, you can decide about certain kinds of care. Is the idea of staged access something that wouldn't simply be saying, well, we'll first extend access to stream 1 patients, in other words, when death is imminent? Because logically, in any case, if we're talking about psychopediatrics or psychiatry, the expert committee report demonstrated that we had to determine a certain chronicity in terms of time, which would exclude teenagers who want to commit suicide. And for other kinds of pathologies as well, if we take something that's degenerative, you have to have exhausted all treatments and all means of relief. And this is not something that's done quickly after a diagnosis. So if we were to open this staged access, let's say between ages 14 and 17, as is the case in Quebec, if we look at decisional capacity, but if this is only open to patients who are facing imminent death, could this be a way of moving forward without that hesitation you seem to have?
Thank you. I actually do agree with that. I do think at this stage that it would be appropriate to only open up to track 1 patients. I do think I agree with presentations that were made elsewhere and consistent with the CCA that you could not be confident that you have irremediable mental health challenge by 18. I'll defer to experts who weigh in that way. But I do think opening up to just track 1 at this stage is appropriate.
Est-ce que Madame...
Could I hear from Ms. Minim?
Yes, thank you. I would agree with that position that track 1 may be the one we're most concerned about at this stage. I do think that that is where we're most vulnerable in terms of a constitutional challenge on behalf of a young person. I do think that the other track, there may be reasons for hesitation in terms of lack of evidence and consultation with young people to understand the full impact. And so we could look at that at a later stage. But I do think that when we're looking at the most damaging circumstances and the most the most serious violation of rights, we are dealing with, I think, the track 1 patient.
Okay, merci beaucoup. And lastly, we'll have Mr. McGregor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair, and appreciate all of our witnesses for being here today. It's not an easy subject, and we do appreciate the expertise that you're bringing to us. Ms. Shaw, I'd like to start with you. You did make a point in your opening statement about talking about how we need to, there is not enough available data from mature minors. We don't know enough about their opinions on this subject, and more is needed to fill those data gaps. So I think we have an ability here, or you have an ability here before the committee, as you know, we intend to produce a report with some substantive recommendations. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how the federal government could play a role in structuring that survey. What would its scope be? How would it work with other levels of government? What are the specific age ranges it needs to work out? Or any particular attention it needs to pay out to children who are of an Indigenous, racialized, or disabled background? Anything you can provide feedback on with regards to that, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. So I think there was a presentation or testimony that was given earlier by Mary Ellen McDonald, and she had talked about quite comprehensive application that is before government for funding that is really trying to fill this particular gap. I think the pieces that are being considered, and whether it's with that project or another, are from groups that have been highlighted as particularly of interest in the CCA report. That would include Indigenous children, children who are in care, children with terminal illnesses. That I think that there are those living with disabilities, and I think I said Indigenous, and their families as well. So I think, we could do a deep dive in terms of what an excellent form of research, and there may be multiple projects that could be, put forward for sure. I know I'm most familiar with the Research Institute at SickKids, that there are researchers there that are wonderful, and I think across the country, that wouldn't be the problem. It's just the time and the, funding to conduct it in a really thorough way.
Thank you for that. Dr. Davies, I only have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to load you up with a couple of questions. First of all, any thoughts that you have just on some supports that may be needed or that we need to address for Indigenous, racialized, or disabled youth? Because, when I look at my riding out on Vancouver Island, I have a very high Indigenous population, and I know there are definitely some gaps in access to healthcare services there. So any thoughts you can offer on that? But also, we did hear the thought that this should be brought in a staged approach, and it's probably preferable to start with track one. But I can see how, this committee, I think, also has to grapple with how this issue of mature minors crosses over to our earlier discussion on mental disorders as sole underlying medical condition. And we've heard from a number of people who say that even like in adults, it's hard to make a determination. We know with children, with how rapidly the brain develops and it goes through different stages. Just if you can offer any expertise based on your personal experiences on that subject, that would be helpful, please.
Yeah, I think mental illness is not my specialty, but I would say that talking to many people about this issue, there is very little appetite for that intersection of mature minors and mental illness as a sole underlying condition, because I think to say something is irremediable before the 18th birthday, and in addition that they have capacity, and we're absolutely positive about that, I think that is unlikely. So I would be very much in favor of going with the track one patients to start with. And for your point of how do we access the voices of all the types of children and youth that we've mentioned, I think that there's lots of child and youth advisory committees attached to every hospital, and there is broad representation. So I would encourage you to get in touch with children's hospitals, and like Bloorview Children's Hospital comes to mind for children with disabilities, and they really are poignant in how they can inform the decisions that we're talking about, I think.
Great. Thank you. I'll leave it at that, Madam Co-Chair.
That was perfect timing for everyone. Thank you very much. I'll turn this back over to my co-chair for questions from the senators.
Thank you, Senator Martin. And we'll begin with 3-minute rounds, 3-minute questions from our senators, beginning with la sénatrice Mégy. Vous avez 3 minutes, Madame Mégy.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
You have 3 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Yes, I have a question for Dr. Davies. With your palliative care experience, Now, I know that we have not yet extended medical assistance in dying to mature minors, but in assessing a young person's independence and vulnerability, how could you know if this is a matter of independence rather than the parent's influence during this conversation? I know that you're suffering. I know that it just seems crazy. You know, do you see how this could happen? How, as an evaluator, could one actually assess the independence of a young person?
Sorry, I'll have to answer in English. I was doing Duolingo until you all came in. But I think that, you know, what we imagine and what really happens when a child is dying are two different things. And I think that it would be so clear to anyone by the time a child or youth actually decided to embark on this pathway, I think their disease would be so advanced, there would be no question. And in fact, I've seen very much the opposite happen, where I've had a few patients that they were past their 18th birthday, could have opted for MAID, have not. And I've actually had one 19-year-old, die by suicide when his disease got too advanced, but not through the channels we're talking about. And so I think the assessment would not be difficult. And I think that parents, by and large, eventually come to see what is happening to their child and become supportive, even if it takes some time. Or, in the case of younger children, the parents can see what's happening and wish that they could exert some decisional capacity over the situation, as they would for many other health decisions they take on the part of their child. But I don't think the evaluation would be difficult.
Merci. Puis, d'après ce que...
Thank you. Based on what you've seen with your clientele, sorry, I'll wait for you to put on your headsets. Okay. So, based on what you've seen with your clientele, do you think that in any given palliative care unit there would be a lot asking for medical assistance in dying if it were to exist?
No. And I think when we look to other countries, we know the numbers are very low. So when we did the Council of Canadian Academies review for Netherlands, for example, I think there was 10 to 13 children. It's very low. It's very infrequent. And in my own clinical experience, I mean, the actual ability of a youth to say, I think I'm dying, is often the day they die or the day before they die. Most children and youth want to live. They want desperately to live. And I think that's why going through a very formal channel like this is going to be very infrequent. Because by the time they come to that realization, it will probably be too late.
Merci, Sénatrice. Senator Kutcher for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses. I think your thoughtful ideas here about addressing Track 1 has been very, very helpful to the committee. So I thank you for that. Currently, the Canadian Association of MAID Providers is developing a training program, soon to be finished, on MAID assessment and provision. It will be certified by the Royal College, the College of Family Physicians, and the Canadian Nursing Association. Are you aware of that program, and if it addresses the issue of mature minors in its totality? And if you're not aware, or if it doesn't, do you think that something like this should be developed for mature minors, perhaps under the auspices of the Royal College, but also the Canadian Pediatric Society, something so that we would have comfort that MAID assessors and MAID providers dealing with mature minors really are meeting a particular standard of professional competency? To any one of the witnesses.
Could you direct it, because they'll all hesitate.
Dr. Davis, Dr. Zlotnick-Shaw, and Cheryl Milne, please.
So I think, and something we talked about at the Council of Canadian Academies a lot, is I don't think we would imagine panels and putting these children and youth through an extra lens of security for us. I think it needs to be embedded in the child's healthcare team, that everybody feels certain that that child has capacity to make that decision. So if there was some extra level of sober second thought for this particular decision, I think it would have to be within the child's team and not some external mechanism. And I'm not aware of the MAID providers program, training program. And there may be nuances that would help them in dealing with youth and mature minors, but I don't think it would be that much different than the work they do every day.
Ms. Milne?
So I think that the standard that we have used for medical decision making for youth and for mature minors, even though that's not really a legal term, it's there isn't a real definition of that, is one that applies both for adults as well as for children. I think that where there's some nuance is around the voluntariness aspect of decision making, because children tend to make those and young people tend to make those with their families supporting them. And so differentiating between a decision that is the autonomous decision of a young person and one that they're making with their family is something that we wouldn't want to see that decision being discounted because they're being supported by their families in making those decisions. So that's the one, I think, tricky area, but mostly it's the same standard of appreciating and understanding what is being proposed, the ability to make that voluntary choice, understanding the gravity of the decision, and what we know from the case law around withdrawal of treatment or refusal of treatment is that when the gravity of the decision is such that the young person is refusing life-sustaining treatment, for example, a significant amount of scrutiny from the medical team is actually placed on that decision. I think that is just the standard practice. And so I don't think we need to make it more difficult for the young person to make that decision legally.
Thank you. Although the time's run out, Ms. Slotnick-Shaw, would you like to quickly comment?
Sure, just quickly, if I understood, you were asking about a training process. And in terms of clinicians that I've spoken to, there is an appetite, again, from the ones I've spoken to, for some clarity of expectations associated, should it be expanded to mature minors. And whether or not this clarity of expectations come from a regulator or a framework that's endorsed by the Royal College, but that clarity is something that I think there is an appetite for. Not an extra layer of steps to take, but for a clarity of expectations. That will likely just be, as Cheryl was saying, similar to what currently happens for other decisions. Thanks.
Thank you. On ira maintenant au sénateur Dalphond pour 3 minutes.
Once more, thank you very much.
And now to Senator Dalphond for 3 minutes.
And I share the precautions are necessary. My question is for you, Dr. Davies. You say that they realize they're going to die quite late in the stage. The battle is over. They lose hope, and they'll die shortly after. So, in fact, will they have access in practice to the MAID process, or will they end up being in palliative sedation because they have reached a point where they are suffering so much? And who is making that decision? Are the parents deciding when the child, even if he's 17, is in such intense pain?
Yeah, I'd have to say most children and youth that I have cared for do not need palliative sedation at the end of life. That's rare. And that's why I think the numbers will be low of the youth that actually want to embark on a process like this. Some may, because I think of that need for autonomy and to have things go the way they want it to go. But I think many youth will not be able to accept even to themselves that they are dying until it's too late. And I think that's one of the main reasons that the numbers will be low. And I think the numbers of adults have sort of borne that out. For the number of people in their 20s is very low compared to numbers of older patients.
And the team that will accompany the family, because I guess it's a family experience, not the most fortunate one. And so are they kind of raising that issue with the patients and the family, or they wait for that the request is coming?
I have had very few conversations with youth about this. There's very few young people that have wanted to talk about hastening their death. The people that I've spoken to are parents of not capable children that wonder why their child must continue to suffer. And that's just my lived experience as a clinician.
Thank you.
Merci, Sénateur. We'll go to
Thank you, Senator.
for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Just want to say thank you, because I'm not sure who said it, but I think the most powerful statement today is delay is not a neutral decision. I think that applies to our entire discussion that we've been having now for years in this country. And what I hear in this conversation is that we're trying to deal with our own concerns, that we as legislators or medical professionals, we don't, we want to make sure we're doing the right thing when this is really about the mature minors, the child, the young person's capacity, and it's their call. So my question is about this process of hearing their voice. When the numbers are so small in the first place, and we're talking about funding projects and going out and giving voice, I am just afraid that this is another push this down the road when in fact delay is not neutral, and we've got some kind of agreement here on track one. Does that concern you? And I'll start with you, Dr. Davies, that we will just push this further down.
Yes, and I think that if you limited it to the youth that were actually imminently dying, we could learn from their experience, and that might inform the other groups of youth going forward. And I think it's true, delay is not neutral, but on the other hand, this is a new sort of experiment for humanity, if you will. And so I think we still need to be careful and to go slowly. And it's just like research. It's baby steps, right, to inform the next stage. So to me, that makes sense.
Do we have this, and I don't know whether Cheryl Milne or Randy, if I can just call you that there. If you've got, and I think you mentioned this, Dr. Davies, as well, that this data, does this information exist at children's hospitals? Obviously, care teams have spoken to children and spoken to families and spoken to legal advisors. Does that not exist anywhere now? Or is there not commentary that we can mine? Cheryl, do you want to go ahead with that?
I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer that. I think that what happened with the expert panel is that there were some interviews done with some young people that were part of like Bloorview and another sort of treatment center. But I do think that mostly when you talk to young people, they want to be respected and listened to, and they want to be treated equally, particularly if they are competent to make decisions. And I think we start from that as a premise. But that the other information we need is about those other groups that we may be expanding MAID to include, that we don't know enough about the young people's experience.
Thank
Dr.
you,
Shaw?
Senator.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll now go to Senator Martin for 3 minutes.
Thank you to our witnesses for your insights that are very important for this really serious discussion about mature minors. And as a parent, I can't even imagine being in a position to have to, consider such a decision, even with a very mature child. You know, a parent should not have to bury a child, so it's such a heavy topic for us. So thank you for your insights. My questions are for Dr. Zlotnick-Shaw. The committee heard from a number of witnesses who were concerned about how social factors such as poverty, stigma, abuse, and the lack of access to care might affect minors' decision-making about MAID. So my first question is, in your view, how do social factors affect a minor's decisional capacity and or the decision-making process?
That's a rich question for sure, and I might defer to Dr. Davies in terms of the capacity assessment. But I think the piece of capacity not being tied exclusively to an age is giving recognition to the lived experience of an individual, informing their ability to understand and appreciate the question before them. So I think in terms of social context, in terms of experience, living with an illness, all these pieces will inform, will add to the maturity they may have in regard to their current context, when as compared to somebody who may just be newly in a position with living with an illness. So I think one's social context, one's lived experience, all of those pieces are what add to one's maturity and capacity to make a particular decision.
Do social factors have a greater or different influence on minors as compared to adults?
I'm not sure in terms of greater or less, but definitely significant. So I do think, I mean, if we're thinking about, again, in terms of moving forward in a multi-pronged way, I think it is really imperative that thinking about doing right by young people include attending to social determinants of health, include being cognizant of inequity related to palliative care, and maybe that be part of the conversation going forward if there is an expansion of MAID, that it go forward with an attention to other places where we need to do better and a plan to do so.
Quick question.
Very quickly.
Yes. Should a minor be disqualified from MAID due to their social circumstances in some cases?
I don't think so. I mean, I think you would still go through that process of understanding and appreciating. I mean, in a sense, that would be, somebody who is living with inequity to then have a further inequity in terms of not being able to access, assistance, being in a state of irremediable suffering. So I wouldn't say that should be a disqualifying. I think if anything, that's impetus on us to have to try to, do better in terms of inequity that's existing in terms of social circumstances. And I this isn't a quick fix for sure, but I think this is a highlight of where we have to do better.
Thank you, Senator Martin. Thank you to our witnesses. This brings our panel to a close. I'd like to thank Dr. Davies for being here with us tonight, as well as Ms. Milne and Ms. Zlotnick-Shaw. Thank you for providing your opening remarks, answering our difficult questions, and for your expertise on this matter. We very much appreciate it. With that, we will suspend momentarily to prepare for the second panel. Thank you. We have the issue of a vote at 8:30 with bells going off at 8. Is there unanimous consent for us to go for 20 minutes after the bells and Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Very good. Very well. We'll have to be very disciplined on the time. But with that, I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of our new witnesses. Before speaking, please wait till I recognize you by name. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through one of the joint chairs. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly for the benefit of the interpreters. And interpretation on this video conference, well, you have the choice. At the bottom of your screen, either floor, English, or French. And there will be certainly questions in English and in French. When you are not speaking, please keep your microphone on mute. So with that, I would like to welcome our witnesses for panel number 2 who are here to discuss mature minors. All as individuals. We have Caroline Marcoux. Nous avons également Roderick McCormick, qui est un professeur.
We also have Roderick McCormick, a professor,
who's a medical doctor, child and adolescent psychiatrist. All three by video conference. So thank you, all of you, for joining us. We'll begin with your opening remarks, which should be limited to 5 minutes. And I'll ask Ms. Marcoux to start off, followed by Mr. McCormick, and then Dr. Amen. Ms. Marcoux, you have 5 minutes. Please go ahead. La parole est à vous.
Ms. Marcoux, you have the floor. Thank you and good evening. I'm Caroline Marcoux. I'm the mother of this beautiful Charles, who's here beside me. On July 30th, 2019, he was diagnosed with osteosarcoma. It's a bone cancer that was in his right femur. He was 15 years and 9 months old at the time. During the year following that, he went through a series of chemotherapy as well as major surgery to his leg to remove the tumor. He was always jovial and optimistic. He was smiling the way you see him in this photo. He was an ideal patient. He was very resilient throughout the whole disease. A few months after treatment ended, he was told that the cancer was back in both of his lungs. He was operated on in both lungs to remove metastases, but despite that, the disease came right back. Not only did it come back to his 2 lungs, but also to his right knee. So that double recurrence meant that there was nothing more that could be done. That disease could not be stopped. This was January 2021. And as was always the case with Charles, he accepted what was happening to him. Psychologically, he felt good, but physically, his conditions started to deteriorate bit by bit. He had less and less energy, he had less and less appetite, and he had increasing pain. So starting in January, I would say there was only 1 good day out of every 2. But he did experience something that a 17-year-old would be very proud of, and that was passing his driver's license. He only had 1 lung then. His left lung was full of liquid, and there was nothing to be done with it. He enjoyed the independence that having a driver's license gave him maybe 3 or 4 times in the week after getting his license, and that was it. After that, he just wasn't well enough to leave the basement. From that point on, even a bit before then, medical follow-ups, emergencies, adjustments of medication were all being done through the palliative care team. And the team was doing its best. Really, they were doing whatever they could, but they just could not calm all of his pain. And that doesn't even deal with all the side effects that he had to deal with. He was hot. He was always hot. And the medication just didn't really work. He could barely sleep. He took diluted morphine, sentinel, methadone, whatever they could throw at him to calm that pain. The number of drugs he was taking kept going up because the pain and the symptoms kept getting worse and worse. His lungs hurt. His shoulders hurt. He was always coughing. It was worrisome. Things obviously were not getting better. Beginning in early July, so not long after he got that driver's license, He could pretty much barely get out of his hospital bed. We had installed that bed in the basement. But he was fed up. He was fed up of doing nothing, fed up of watching TV, fed up of being in pain all the time. He had no quality of life because that was the situation. And he began to worry and worry about dying. He was wondering how he would die, when he would die. Was he going to be alone? How was it going to happen? He was calm and measured by nature. So to see him have panic attacks and be so anxious just showed how powerless he felt in his situation. He just was at the end of his tether. Towards mid-July, he started talking about medical assistance in dying. He talked to me about it. He talked to his social work about it, to his doctors. He asked whether he would be able to have it because he just couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't wait anymore. He didn't want to keep on suffering and waiting for death. We knew that the end was imminent. We knew he was going to die. That wasn't the issue. But he would have wanted to have the choice to be able to control the time of his death. It probably would have reassured him. And, what he was saying was he would have liked to have some control over that disease, at least for that choice. And he hadn't had any control over it for the 2 preceding years. He'd never talked about death before that time. He had always been positive. But when he asked for it, he was already terminal. We knew that death was imminent. But we had to wait because he was age 17 and 9 months at the time. As a mother, having your child ask you, "Mom, do something. I can't take it anymore," that is absolutely inhuman. I was with him to the end. I was with him in his suffering. I would have wanted to give him what he wanted, to grant his wish, to do anything possible to make him feel calmer, to feel reassured, to calm his pain. But all doctors could do would just increase his medication. He could barely talk because he was so drugged. He wasn't eating anymore. He could at least express his needs, tell me what he wanted. But the only possible solution at that point was palliative sedation. And one day he asked for it. He was just absolutely fed up. He just wanted to just sleep and not be aware of his condition anymore. So he went into the hospital, into the pediatric ward, because that's what he wanted. And he was put into artificial sleep. And for 24 long hours, we were there with him. His sleep did not seem to be peaceful. Again, it's as though the drugs just weren't enough to calm things. They had never been able to calm his pain in the past. He didn't look comfortable. And I can tell you that myself as a mother, to see him in that condition and to not be able to understand what he needed and to have to just wait for him to be completely unconscious, it was a very long 24 hours. He died on July 30th, 2021, exactly 2 years to the day after his diagnosis. At that time, he was 17 years and 9 months old. I lost my son, but I'm clinging to 2 promises that I made to him. First of all, to take the trip of his dreams to England, which he didn't have time to do. And when he asked for medical assistance in dying, I told him that I would do everything possible to speak the way I'm doing here, to do everything I could to make medical assistance in dying accessible to youth if they, like he, wanted it. Charles was a mature youth, even before getting sick. He was a mature teenager, very mature. Those last 2 years of his life, he went through them with serenity, and they made it possible for me to have the strength to go through that with him and to lose him. I took care of him until his dying breath. I would have taken care of him as long as it was necessary. I didn't want to lose my son, but I couldn't take watching him suffer, and he couldn't take suffering anymore. He had reached his physical and his psychological limits. I would have taken care of him right to the end, but I was hoping not to have to see him lose all his dignity. I hoped not to have to be changing his diapers and see him waste away to become a walking skeleton. I would have taken care of him until then, but I hoped that that didn't happen. And happily, he still had his nice puffy cheeks when he died. but he was really at the end of his rope. I know that this is not a decision to be taken lightly, extending this to mature minors. And Charles, he was 17 at the end of his life, and it's not a decision he took lightly either. It might not have changed his time of death by much. He was at the end of his life already. Maybe he would have set a date, and maybe it would have been a few days before July the 30th. But he was ready, and he deserved being able to have that choice. It would have been his decision. It would have been his choice of when to leave, how to go. The only choice, the last choice he could have made in his life. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Marcoux, for this very personal testimony about your son, Charles. It's been very moving and touching. Thank you.
Go to our second witness, Mr. Roderick McCormick. Mr. McCormick, you have 5 minutes.
Sego, my name's Dr. Rod McCormick, and I'm Mohawk or Ganagahaga. I'm also a professor and research chair in Indigenous Health at Thompson Rivers University. I live on my partner's First Nations Reserve of the Kamloops to Secwepemc in Kamloops, BC, and I'm director of Indigenous Research Center called All My Relations. I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation to provide input once again on Bill C-7. Previously, I testified on the implications of Bill C-7 for those suffering from mental illness. I'd like to extend those views as they pertain to MAID for mature minors. The expansion of MAID is occurring at too rapid a pace, in my opinion. I've learned through painful experience that when you're on a slippery incline or hill, or in this case, a slippery slope, the best way to avoid falling is to take small, careful steps. As I'm an Indigenous health professor and research chair who has also had approximately 35 years of experience as a mental health service provider for Indigenous peoples, my testimony will be from an Indigenous mental health perspective. I should start by saying that I have grave concerns over the extension of MAID for minors, and I use the term grave in a purposeful manner. As my partner and kids are members of Kamloops to Secwepemc, and I live in their community, I experienced firsthand the impact of the announcement of the 215 children's graves in the grounds of the residential school. I can clearly see the residential school from the windows of my house and can make out a glimpse of the fields in which the 215 children have been buried in shallow graves. This attempt to conceal the bodies is in a way symbolic of the numerous historical attempts by Canada to deal with what Duncan Campbell Scott referred to as the need to get rid of the Indian problem. Those attempts, as many of you probably know, have consisted of forced starvation, forced sterilization, forced relocation to reserves with unsafe, unhealthy, crowded housing, introduction of liquor, smallpox blankets, forced residential schooling, experimentation with malnutrition in residential schools, ignoring the contagion of tuberculosis in the residential schools, the ongoing child welfare seizure of children's, excessive imprisonment of Indigenous peoples in the penal system, and the list goes on. What I'm saying is that because of the multiple ways in which Canada has utilized to eliminate Indigenous peoples and culture, we are overrepresented at every stage of the healthcare system, including that of premature deaths. This may all seem overly dramatic to you, but do we really need yet another path to death? My cynicism is partially based on decades of working with Indigenous youth to help them attain and maintain a good and healthy life. As I mentioned in my previous testimony, I've worked with many Indigenous youth in emotional pain who were able to recover from being suicidal. The common reflection they had upon recovery was one of relief that they did not choose a permanent solution to what proved to be a temporary problem. Getting the proper and timely help is key to survival. There are many barriers to attaining that help. Among them are a lack of accurate diagnosis and corresponding treatments, a racist healthcare system, a mistrust of the healthcare system, which doesn't always have our best interests in mind, jurisdictional ambiguity, and abdication of responsibility by various governments, and the big factor, remoteness of our communities. Living on reserve and or in a remote location often means that health services are provided by nurses or nurse practitioners who are often overworked and ill-prepared to provide the range of services that are required. This is especially the case in the near total absence of palliative care services for Indigenous children and youth. In preparing the statement, I scoured the internet looking for evidence showing mental illness can be predicted to be irremediable, and I couldn't find any. Shouldn't public policy, such as important as this, be informed by evidence? Some argue we discriminate against minors and those with mental anguish if they are not allowed access to MAID. But without evidence, are we not also discriminating against those very groups in another way? Currently, I believe the law provides the option for the minor to self-assess as to whether various methods of treatment are appropriate for them and to refuse such treatment that they deem inappropriate. From my clinical experience, most youth are not aware of the diverse treatment options that they have, nor do they have an accurate understanding of them. Granted, for Indigenous youth, those options might not even be available to them in their communities. But should not equal healthcare in Canada be available to all Canadians? Can teenagers whose brains are still developing make such important decisions? Although I obviously cannot speak for all Indigenous peoples, the pattern I am seeing in the introduction and expansion of this legislation is that of an abdication of responsibility by the Government of Canada and by extension the citizens of Canada. Instead of making every effort to provide the range of mental health services needed by Indigenous youth to overcome their pain, we are instead imposing upon them the burden to decide if they should choose a government-sanctioned permanent solution to what could easily be a temporary problem. That is where mainstream Canadian cultural values fail us all. The emphasis on individual rights and individual freedom is not balanced with the need for collective responsibility. In closing, I would like to read you a statement by the existential psychiatrist, Dr. Viktor Frankl. Freedom is not the last word. Freedom is only part of the story and half of the truth. Freedom is but the negative aspect of the whole phenomena whose positive aspect is responsibleness. In fact, freedom is in danger of degenerating to mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness. So I urge this committee to advocate for the Government of Canada and the provinces to accept their collective responsibility to not expand MAID to minors, but to instead improve the mental health services available to Indigenous youth and for all the youth of Canada. Yama, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McCormick. We'll now go to Dr. Amon. Dr. Amon, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you for the invitation to stand before this committee. My name is Dr. Timothy Eamon, and I have been practicing child and adolescent psychiatry for 10 years in a variety of inpatient, outpatient, academic, and community settings. I would like to begin my testimony by stating categorically that to extend the current MAID regime to minors, mature or otherwise, is negligent and irresponsible. This debate began shortly after I began practice and has been like a dark cloud looming over my early career. I have followed as the Government of Canada has forged ahead despite many warnings to desist. I am adding my voice that it would be wise for the government to proceed no further down this dark path. The proposition that death is a legitimate treatment for any form of suffering is false. The proposition that the physician community can reliably assess the competence and capacity of minors to consent to death is false. It is not supported by any available research on the subject. Any physician who peddles this message is doing little more than saying, "Trust me, I'm a doctor." There does not exist any standardized, reliable, valid assessment for determining the capacity and competence of minors. Research has demonstrated that unaided competence judgments, even from seasoned and otherwise skilled physicians, are unreliable. In routine medical practice, children are oftentimes incompletely informed, and the communication between an adult physician and child is oftentimes flawed. There are many systemic influences that influence a child's decision-making. No decision made is free from influence. This raises the important question of how to evaluate precisely how free the child is in any decision. One new systemic influence just might be the cultural shift that the Government of Canada is propagating, moving our society increasingly towards a culture of despair. The government messaging that it will offer death as a solution to life suffering is suicide inducement. We are well aware of the phenomena of suicide clustering in youth, such as on reserves, and that messages of despair increase suicide rates. It is a difficult time to be a child in Canada. MAID is not an evidence-based medical practice. As such, compelling physicians to adopt this practice through law sullies and undermines the integrity of the medical profession. Canadian physicians have been trained to practice modern, evidence-based medicine directed by scientific fact, not postmodern, ideologically based medicine directed by political authorities. MAID is an experimental practice without pre-existing safety data or adverse outcomes reporting or adequate safeguards and accountability. The Government of Canada needs to hold itself to the same level of accountability and standard as it would hold any pharmaceutical company before a new drug or treatment was introduced to the Canadian population. And we do not subject children to high-risk experiments. Minors are a categorically vulnerable population. Postmodern philosophies that postulate that to exclude vulnerable populations from the right to death is to discriminate against them are shallow and dangerous. Legislation that is undergirded by these philosophies is a risk to our children. The Canadian government and its representatives are conducting themselves paternalistically with regards to the MAID regime. Organizations representing disadvantaged and vulnerable groups within our society who have presented evidence to this committee have been disregarded. These representative groups have asked for either safeguards or exclusion from eligibility for MAID for their communities and been denied such. The Government of Canada has effectively communicated to these groups that the government knows better what is in their interests than these vulnerable populations themselves do. In modern society, with modern medicine and scientific advances, the need to kill a child does not exist. Why then the Canadian government's headlong rush to open up the MAID regime to minors? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eamon. We'll now go to questions. I'll transfer it to my co-chair, Senator Martin.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, are MPs all right if we were to do 4-minute rounds? 4 minutes, is that okay? Monsieur Thériault? Oui? 4 minutes. Merci beaucoup. Okay, then we'll begin with Mr. Cooper for 4 minutes, or are you
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to share 1 minute of my time with Madame Vian.
So you have 3 minutes, and Madame Vian will have 1. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Eamon, there are some witnesses who've come before the committee and have noted that mature minors make complex and significant medical decisions, and therefore it follows that a MAID ought to be expanded to mature minors. What do you say?
What complex decisions are you referencing? Because
for example, the decision to end life-sustaining treatment.
So the question is, what is a minor's capacity to end a life-sustaining treatment? I believe that was, I don't know the details probably as well as some of the lawyers of the case, but I believe that was recently ruled on in the AC versus Manitoba. And I do know that it's a complex assessment that takes into account the emotional, intellectual, and psychological state and maturity of the child, and that the context occurs not just with the child alone, but also in the broader family context of the family. Of course, in our culture, we look at children as individuals, and as adults, we look as adult assessors, we're trying to determine at what point do they have the capacity, the intellectual ability that we possess to make our decisions. One of the things that we forget about is that there's a theory that children actually are one part of a larger organism, that larger organism being the family. So it's a very complex decision.
How would you distinguish, for example, that from MAID? It's a broad question, but the point that is being made is that if mature minors can make some of these life-altering medical decisions, then why shouldn't they also have the option of MAID?
Right. So why shouldn't they have the option that we're giving adults presently? Refusing a life-sustaining treatment and asking for a treatment that the objective of which is death are fundamentally and categorically, we're talking about two different things. That you can't compare the two.
Okay, you spoke about research with respect to competence judgments and the unreliability of such judgments. Can you expand on that research?
Yeah, so as it pertains specifically to child and adolescents, there are many, many articles in the literature discussing this issue, but there's actually been no systematic studies. As recently as 2012, 2014, assessors were starting to look at how do we actually objectively assess the capacity of minors to consent to be research participants in medical studies. And as recently as then, they were stating that there is no objective assessment. There's no standard of assessment for determining that this child has capacity and this child does not have capacity. There was a review in 2020.
Sorry, I have to stop you here. There's 1 minute given to Madame Vien.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, j'irai droit au but. Bonjour, Madame.
Thank you. I'll head straight to the point. Good evening, Ms. Marcoux. Good evening. Would you say that Charles had the ability to decide? Absolutely. Tell me why. What makes you think that he had decisional capacity? Charles was always a very decided youth. He had his ideas. He was mature at all times. He was a positive leader. And even in his disease, he gained maturity going through that whole trial. He was our pillar. He was the one who was resilient. And he was very lucid, very conscious of his situation. He knew that death was imminent. He knew that there was nothing that could be done. He had made medical decisions for 2 years. He made the decisions. They were his. It was his own will. It was in his own maturity. And this one, too, was his decision. Neither I nor anyone else ever talked to him about medical assistance in dying. It came from him because he just couldn't take it anymore. Thank you very much.
Next, we will go to Mr. Ananda Sangari. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panel, but particularly Madame Marcoux, I want to thank you for bringing a real-life perspective to this discussion. I'm wondering, you've heard from both Mr. McCormick and Mr. Amen. I'm wondering if you could maybe take a couple of minutes to walk us through what you've went through and what your perspectives of Charles's ability to make a decision and how and in what challenges you faced as a family in accessing MAID for a mature minor, and if you can also speak to some of the issues brought forward by Mr. Amen with respect to MAID not something that should not be available to minors overall.
Oui. Pour ce qui est de Charles,
Well, when it comes to Charles, during the 2 years of his disease, he chose what kind of operation he was going to undergo for his leg. He chose to stop treatment when it just wasn't giving him any results. He made the medical decisions. He made them with the support of the medical team and talking with the doctors. Yes, it was a family decision. Yes, we talked about it. The family has to be consulted in all of this. But he was 17 years old. He was able to make his own decisions. And what I saw with all the children that we saw for those 2 years, the children who were sick, very often illness brings with it greater maturity, a sort of wisdom in a way. Maybe that hasn't been scientifically proven, but it's what I saw, that for several of them, maturity comes with illness. It was his decision. It was his decision at the end. And it wasn't at the point of diagnosis. He didn't just give up at the diagnosis, or not even during treatments. It was only at the end when he just couldn't take the suffering. He was losing his independence and his dignity. It was exactly the same situation as if he had had another 3 months. If he was 3 months older, he would have been an adult. He would have been able to make the decision. He was more mature than many adults that I know who do have the right to make that decision.
Thank you, Madame, for sharing this with us again. I do want to just note that as you advocate, because I know this is one of the commitments you made to Charles, as you advocate for the availability of MAID for mature minors, I want to just get a sense from you as to what type of obstacles or what type of challenges you've faced in ensuring that MAID is available for mature minors.
So very briefly, Madame.
En fait, j'ai pas posé.
Well, I didn't do much. The first impactful one is really today. What I've been doing for the last year and a half is to make everybody around me aware. Whenever I can talk about this publicly, I do. That's really more in terms of consciousness raising. I haven't run into any barriers up until now in talking about it with people, telling his story. I mean, the people that I've talked to see that it's important to extend this. Thank you very much.
And next we have Monsieur Thériault for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Joint Chair. Good evening, Ms. Marcoux, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's really my pleasure. It's always a pleasure to talk about Charles. Now, you said that he had 2 wishes. Let me reassure you, this evening, you are doing a brilliant job of granting one of his wishes in speaking to us the way you have and being as strong as you have been to make his wishes known. Now, you said that he deserved to be able to make that choice. Do you believe that in his position, let's say, had he been able to make the choice, would his anxiety have been calmed? Would it have calmed him down? If so, why? I think so. I think he was really in a state of waiting. He was just waiting for death and fearing because he didn't know when it was going to happen. Yes, he had some drugs for the anxiety, and they did work sometimes, but he couldn't take it anymore. He asked for palliative sedation because that was the only solution available to him, which was to sleep and not suffer anymore. It would have granted him serenity if he had been able to choose. He would have had the control over the last moment, and to be sure that I was going to be there with him, because he was very worried about that. I had to be with him all the time, night and day. He was afraid of being alone at the time of dying. Had he had the choice, my impression is that, yes, it would have reassured him. Just being able to decide where, when, how, with whom, that would have reassured him. And for him, well, he wanted palliative sedation, but was it his number one choice? How did he experience that palliative sedation, and how did he make the decision for it? Was it easy? Well, it was Plan B. He knew that right from the start. Right when he knew that he couldn't get medical assistance in dying, he knew that the only option remaining was palliative sedation. He waited a bit because there was a new pill that had calmed his anxiety. He waited a few days, but ultimately he did ask for it. But it was his Plan B. You know, it was a solution because he had no choice, but it would not have been his first choice. It wasn't the option. It wasn't option A. Was he as serene as had there been in medical assistance in dying? Was he serene with this? Did it offend him? Did it bother him to have to use this solution? Well, it disturbed him. Well, between the two, I'd say between the point where he knew that he wasn't entitled to medical assistance in dying and the point where he decided on sedation, between those two, yeah, he was upset, he was angry, he was anxious. He was highly anxious and worried about this. So yes, it offended him to not have access to it. It bothered him. So plan B, sedation, okay, it did calm that anxiety. And he was okay with that decision once he made it. Once he made the decision to be put to sleep, he was okay with it. But the state in which it placed him for 24 hours, he was already at the end of his life. Maybe he would have died the same day anyways, even without sedation. He was really at the end of his rope. But yes, he had been angry. Yes. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Mr. McGregor. 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today, and Madam Marco in particular. You know, thank you for having the courage for sharing a very personal story with us, and we certainly offer our sincere condolences to what you and Charles went through. We have had a number of witnesses on this subject, you know, discuss like when capacity forms, and your son Charles, you know, he was almost an adult. He was almost a legally aged adult at age 17. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, had this disease struck earlier at a younger age, how do you think you and Charles would have approached this question, you know, say if he'd been at age 12, 13, or 14? We're just wondering, because I think that's an important question for our committee to consider, you know, especially when we're dealing with pretty young ages and these terrible diseases strike.
Ouais. Ça reste hypothétique.
Well, it's a hypothetical question, of course. I can't know how he would have gone through it at age 13 or 12. But Charles was always a mature person, regardless of whatever age he was. You know, he wasn't a normal teenager. You know, he was very calm and very measured. He would probably have been as mature even at age 12 or 13. As I was saying, the other sick children that I saw, even very young ones, and the older ones, they all were serene with respect to their disease. I spoke to other parents who lost their children, and their children helped them. I mean, our children help us go through these diseases and the grieving process after, because they accept it. They have that maturity, that resilience to be able to accept the disease and to live with it and to deal with it and do whatever is necessary to overcome it or not, and accept death. Would he have made the same decision? Would he have been gone to the end of his rope at age 12 as well? Probably. The situation is the same 2 years of difficult disease. Maybe. We'll never know.
For my last couple of minutes, I just want to turn to Dr. Amen. Dr. Amen, I did listen to your opening statement, and I understand you have a very strong position on this matter, but you've also had the benefit of listening to a very personal story. And I'm just wondering, sir, is your position on this absolute? If you're dealing with a minor who has an incurable disease like cancer, who is obviously living through such pain and suffering, is it your position as a doctor that the only option available to them is to go through palliative sedation? Is, in your mind, there ever an exception to this, or is your position absolute on this, that it should be denied until age 18 in all cases, no matter the circumstances?
I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. Let me share a story with you. I had a 17-year-old adolescent who I cared for back in 2018. Her mother died when she was 7. For the next 3 years, she was sexually assaulted repetitively by a family member. Between the ages of 10 and 12, she immigrated to Canada. In Canada, after a handful of years, at the age of 15, she was kicked out by her father. Living independently, going to school full-time, working fast food, pretty much 40 hours a week. I met her in the emergency department. She was suicidal. I admitted her hospital. I was the first person that she had shared the sexual abuse with. And after sharing that with me, she fell apart, full-blown PTSD and depression. And I sat with that child day in and day out with her in sobbing, asking Dr. Eamon, let me die, let me go home, I want to die. It was the worst psychological suffering I've ever witnessed. It affected me profoundly personally. She spent 6 months on our inpatient unit, in and out. I can tell you, I wondered about that question, what is the right thing to do? At the end of the day, however, I am committed that when we are faced with our patients who are suffering a medical condition or a mental health condition or from life circumstances, the physician's role is always to protect and preserve life. For her, I don't know how she's doing now. I know that she made it through those hospitalizations and recovered, in part because of the service that we provided in hospital. And because she was there for 6 months, my colleagues were all involved with it as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Eamon. At this time, I will return this back to my co-chair.
Thank you. And as you know, members, we have to break in 13 minutes because of a vote. So to allow each of the senators a chance to speak, I'm afraid I'm going to have to limit you to 2 minutes per senator, starting with Madame Mégy. Vous avez 2 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Thank you, Madame Marcoux, for sharing such a personal story with us. My question is for Dr. Eamon. If Dr. McCormick has time, he could also reply. We heard your position right from the start. I am asking you whether the federal government should establish a legislative framework for this kind of request, or wait for minors and their families to raise the issue by going to court. Is there a right way for the federal government to address this issue? Beginning with Mr. Eamon. Dr. Eamon.
That's a very good question, and I probably do not know the answer to it. I'm a physician, not a lawyer or a parliamentarian. I think that fundamentally my position is that to request physicians to consider death as treatment, some part of their routine practice, I'm concerned about that. And I think that's very, very dangerous for our profession. And it puts patients at risk in general. And I'm quite concerned as a psychiatrist seeing what's happened with the adult legislation under the current regime. We were promised that the mentally ill are not going to be involved, and it's going to be opening up to them. I'm concerned that this is going to be moving very quickly to my patient group, which is the children and adolescents with mental illnesses, and that's a very dangerous group to offer MAID to.
Merci, sénatrice. No, il reste 20 secondes.
Thank you, Senator. You just have 20 seconds left, so it's not enough.
2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mrs. Marcoux, thank you very much for your personal testimony. As someone who has consulted to pediatric oncology wards, your story rings exceedingly true. In a previous session, a witness who is a MAID provider told us that all those who have chosen MAID have died a good death. You and your son considered MAID, but it was not available to him. Had it been available to him, do you think his death may have been better, that he would have been conscious until the moment he died? Or would you think he would have preferred to stay in palliative sedation?
Je pense qu'il aurait préféré.
I think he would have preferred to move forward maybe just by a few days. It was only a matter of days. He was already, when he asked for it, he died 2 or 3 weeks later, so it wasn't a very long time. It would have prevented those last days, which were not easy days for him. He had terrible nights. He had nightmares. The pain was constant. He had no quality of life. And even in palliative sedation, he didn't look comfortable. He didn't look well. He was moving around all the time. We spoke to him, and it was as though he were answering to us. He would just mumble. He was reacting, but he just didn't seem to be comfortable at all. He wasn't sleeping a deep and comfortable sleep, even when he was sedated. So those last days, and especially the last day that he spent in sedation, would have been avoided had there been medical assistance in dying.
Senator Kutcher, Senator Delfont.
Question à vous, Madame Marcoux.
I have a question for you, Ms. Marcoux. When your son Charles asked for palliative care or asked for continuous sedation, did doctors refuse? Did they say you don't have the ability to consent? We have to ask for your parents' position. Are you sure this is what you want? No, not at all. Well, yes. I mean, they asked him to confirm, based on their protocol, they had to confirm that this is in fact what he wanted. But the doctor had always addressed the question to him during the last days, the last week, I would say, when he was asking him if he was ready, if this was the time for sedation. And the day where Charles said, yes, today's the day, Charles was absolutely decided that was the day he just wanted to sleep. So, yes, the doctor asked him, and before injecting, he asked him again to confirm that it was his decision. And, he respected the whole protocol. So nobody questioned his capacity? Absolutely not. Thank you. Thank you.
To Senator Wallen.
Thank you very much. To Dr. Eamon, you have said that refusing life-saving treatment is fundamentally different than MAID, but both are designed to alleviate pain and hasten death. So the end result is the same. Why do you make the distinction?
Right, I make the distinction because the journey getting there is quite different. For refusing a life-sustaining treatment, the physicians are not actively participating in terms of the demise of the patient in a direct way.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking about, because it seems to be about the position of the physician, not the actual patient.
Right, and as physicians, our role is to provide, I believe there's a phrase that goes, comfort always, relieve suffering frequently, and we cure rarely, something along that line. But essentially the problem is that when the physician actually becomes part of the death process particularly for non-dying patients, which we're starting to see MAID being offered to, I have grave concerns about that.
But do you think actually the doctor's views are more important than the patient's views? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Right. In my practice working with children and adolescents, I take into consideration everyone's views, and we're all working towards the best interest of the child and the adolescent.
And sorry, I'm out of time here, but I take it you are opposed to MAID, period, not just for youth or those with mental illness, but you're opposed to MAID.
As a physician, I'm opposed to MAID and having our profession deliver this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wallen. Senator Martin.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to add my voice to others. The courage that you have shown in sharing your personal story is really admirable, Ms. Marcoux. My question is for Dr. McCormick. Charles was an exceptional teenager, and there are other exceptional mature minors, but as you stated, most youth are not aware of the various treatment options that they have, nor do they have an accurate understanding of them. And particularly with Indigenous youth, what suggestions do you have for overcoming the barriers that Indigenous youth have in obtaining help that they need?
Sure, and I should also clarify that I'm not opposed to MAID in track one. um, in particular for adults, my sister-in-law actually was at her death was inevitable, and actually the cancer spread to her throat, so she was at risk of choking to death when she received MAID. I am opposed to it for mental illness and for minors, particularly for mental illness, and I think what we could be doing is first of all talking to youth. And talking to Indigenous youth, I think without actually consulting with us properly, there will be legal cases, I'm sure of it, because that is a right under UNDRIP. But I think we need to provide, let's spend some money on mental health. I mean, there's the poor cousin of the health field. We don't spend money on it. And provide accessible diagnosis and treatment centers, mental health navigators, get rid of the jurisdictional game, fund Jordan's principle properly, provide life skills training to a youth and how to problem solve, how to express emotions, provide services that others get like palliative care, provide training and support to frontline workers, develop peer support programs for youth. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There's just so much that needs to be done, and we don't do it. We just, everything's at the postvention stage, not at the prevention stage. It's a crisis-oriented healthcare system for Indigenous people.
Thank you very much to our three panelists this evening. I think that it's important for us to recognize that providing your testimony this evening involves making very personal statements about what you believe. And that takes courage as well, and it's important for us as members of this committee with very difficult work ahead of us to hear from all of you. Alors, merci à tous d'avoir fourni le temps et d'avoir...
Thank you to everybody for having taken the time and to answer our questions and to come and appear before us and give us such personal testimonies. Thank you very much and have a pleasant evening.
Adjourned.